Hello everyone, my name is Hannah Myers. I am a dietetic intern and grad student, and today I will be presenting to you all on macronutrients. So, what are nutrients? They're defined by the National Institutes of Health as chemical compounds in food that are used by the body to function properly and maintain health. There are two types of nutrients, macronutrients and micronutrients. Macronutrients provide energy in the form of calories, while micronutrients do not. Macronutrients include fat, protein, and carbohydrates, while micronutrients include vitamins and minerals. And macronutrients are needed in large quantities by the body, but micronutrients are only needed in small quantities. Pretty much everything you eat in a day contains some type of macronutrients, and you probably see some examples of something you might have even eaten today in one of these pictures. There are also examples of foods that provide multiple types of macronutrients, for example, milk, which can be a source of protein, fat, and carbohydrate. First, we're going to start off talking about what carbohydrates actually are. So we're going to break that into types of carbs, sources of carbs, digestion and absorption of carbs, insulin and blood sugar, and then the functions of carbs in the body. There are two types of carbohydrates, which are simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. There are two types of simple carbs. One sugar molecule, which is called a monosaccharide, or two sugar molecules, or two monosaccharides linked together, which is called a disaccharide. These don't really require much effort or time for the body to break down, so they can be used very quickly for energy. Complex carbohydrates are composed of 3 or more sugars linked together and are divided into oligosaccharides, which are 3 to 10 monosaccharides, or polysaccharides, which are also multiple monosaccharides and are more complex than oligosaccharides. Both of these take longer to be broken down, which means that they take longer to digest than simple carbs and release energy a little bit more slowly. So sugar is the monosaccharide or disaccharide simple carb. Some examples are glucose and fructose, which are monosaccharides, and lactose or milk sugar, which is a disaccharide, and sucrose or table sugar, which is a disaccharide. They can be added to foods like you would see in desserts or soda or candy, or they can be found naturally like fruit and milk. Starch is a type of complex carb as it is made of multiple glucose molecules linked together. Starchy foods are easier and quicker for your body to break down than complex carbs that contain fiber, so your body will get energy more quickly from these foods. Some examples of starches include rice, pasta, white bread, potatoes, and corn. Fiber is another type of complex carb. It is also made of sugars linked together, but the way they are linked makes it so your body can't break it down in the same way as starches or sugars, so the fiber in your foods are non-digestible. Some types of foods that contain fiber include vegetables, whole grains such as whole grain bread, beans, fruits, and nuts, just to name a few examples. There are two types of fiber. So soluble fiber decreases your blood cholesterol and LDL levels. It reduces the difficulty of passing stool, and it slows your blood sugar release after eating. So instead of sugary or starchy foods where your blood sugar might spike dramatically, your blood sugar increases a lot more gradually after eating fiber. And this is related to the fact that your body can't break down fiber in the same way as starch, so it releases the sugars a lot more gradually. And this helps with keeping your blood sugar in a healthy range and keeping you full for longer. And then insoluble fiber absorbs water, softens stool, adds bulk to stool, helps keep your bowel movements regular, and it decreases the risk of diverticulosis and diverticulitis. Fiber has a lot of health benefits, and it's also been shown to have properties that can help protect against cancer. So overall, fiber is a healthy choice, and it's highly recommended that you choose foods that contain fiber over sugars or starches as the primary source of carbs in your diet. Next, I'd like to talk about the way that your body digests and absorbs carbs. So starches and disaccharides, like we said before, are linked chains of monosaccharides, and so your body will break them back down into monosaccharides through enzymes that are in your saliva or released by your pancreas. And then fiber, like we said before, is structured differently from starch, so it can't be broken down by those same enzymes in your body, which is why they aren't digested, and that helps with slowing the release of sugar into your blood. And then when it comes to carbohydrate absorption, the monosaccharides that your body has broken those starches and sugars into are absorbed from your intestines into your blood, and then through your blood they're transported to your liver, where they're either stored in the liver as glycogen, which is your body's version of carbohydrates that it uses to store energy, or it's passed back into the blood through the circulatory system and to other tissues in order to provide energy for your other cells. And then next, I'd like to briefly talk about insulin and its relationship with carbs in your body, because that's essentially what your body uses in order to do anything with the sugars that it's gotten from your food. And so when your blood sugar increases, also known as your blood glucose, this causes your pancreas in response to produce insulin, and then basically insulin functions as the key to our cells so that the blood glucose can actually get into those cells for energy. So insulin binds to receptors on the cells, basically acting like a key to a lock, and that opens the door to the cell so that the sugar from the blood is able to get into the cell and provide that energy. And then I'd like to use this diagram to help you visualize what the body's insulin response would look like. And so each black arrow up at the top indicates when you would have a meal, and the blue line represents your blood glucose, which, as you can see, increases after each meal because the carbs from the meal get digested by the body and increase your blood glucose. And then the red line represents insulin, and you can see after each meal it also increases because the blood glucose increase after your meal indicates to your pancreas that we need insulin. And so your pancreas releases that insulin. The insulin acts as the key to the cells in order to release the blood glucose into the cells for energy, and then that causes that blood glucose to drop again, and that causes the insulin to drop. And you can see with each meal, the blood glucose increases and the insulin increases. And that's kind of the trend that we normally see when you eat any meal with carbohydrates in it. And when you eat a food that is higher in sugar or starch, that glucose spike is even more because it's easier to release all that glucose into your blood. And so your insulin spike will be even greater, and that will cause your glucose to more suddenly decrease. And when people talk about feeling like a crash after they eat sugar or high starch meals, that's usually what you're experiencing, is that drop in glucose in response to that sudden increase in insulin. And when you eat foods that are higher in fiber, that causes that blood glucose to not spike so much after a meal and to be a little bit more gradual. So your insulin response isn't quite as dramatic, and so you don't suddenly drop off in your blood glucose and your energy levels. And then overall, the body does a pretty good job of regulating blood sugar. So just like we just talked about, in response to high blood sugar, the body will release insulin from the pancreas. The insulin binds to receptors on the cells, acts like a key so it can open up the cells, and the blood glucose can enter the cells, thereby decreasing the blood sugar. And then in response to low blood sugar, the pancreas releases glucagon, which is a different hormone from insulin, and it tells your liver that the body needs more energy. And you might remember from before, we briefly mentioned that glycogen is the body's version of carbohydrates that it holds on to for when it needs more energy. And glucagon tells the liver to break this glycogen into glucose and then release it into the blood, and then that causes the blood sugar to increase. Next, we're going to briefly talk about the functions of carbohydrates. So it has four main functions, which are to provide energy, to store energy, to build macromolecules, and to spare protein and fat. One of the functions of carbohydrates is to provide energy to all cells in your body. This is through a process known as glycolysis, in which when the glucose enters the cell will break down the glucose and generate what's known as ATP, which is basically a molecule of energy that your cells use to power pretty much all of the processes it has to do within the cell. And glucose is also used as a component of cellular respiration, which is basically something that your cells, all of them, need to do in order to survive. And this also generates ATP. Another function of carbs is to store energy. So after your body has used up all that extra blood sugar in order to fuel all of the tissues around your body that need that energy, all of those extra carbs from the glucose are stored in your liver and in your muscle as glycogen. And you have about 4,000 calories worth of glycogen stored in your body. And so it's a lot, and it can be broken down into glucose by the liver, like we talked about, and it's used when your blood sugar is low. And in this picture here, on the left, these are two types of starches. Every one of those little hexagons represents a glucose molecule. And then on the right is glycogen. And you can see that glycogen has a lot of glucose in it. So it has a ton of energy available, more so than, one molecule of starch. And so it's pretty valuable. And then another function of carbohydrates is to build macromolecules in your cells. And macromolecule literally just means large molecule. Carbs are used to make ribose and deoxyribose, which are monosaccharides, and they're used to build DNA, RNA, and ATP. RNA is a genetic translation of your DNA, and it is used for a lot of your cellular functions. There's multiple types of RNA with different functions. And then ATP, like we talked about before, is a molecule that's used for energy in your cells. And finally, the last function of carbohydrates that I wanted to talk about is that it spares your protein and your fat in your body from being broken down for energy. And so protein gets broken down for energy when there isn't enough glucose. This usually happens from your muscle, and we really don't want your body to be breaking down your muscle in order to get that energy. And so if we have enough glucose, it means that your proteins aren't getting broken down. And then it also protects your fat, also known as your lipids, from being broken down when there isn't enough glucose, because the insulin, when there is glucose present, tells the body to use glucose instead of fat. And this means that having enough glucose means we aren't breaking down fats, which isn't always the best for our body. And next, I'd like to move on to the next kind of macronutrient that we're going to discuss, which is protein. And so we're going to discuss what protein is, amino acids, sources of protein, digestion and absorption of protein, and then the functions of protein in the body. So proteins are used for many, many processes throughout the entire body. They're used in every single cell for a lot of different cellular processes. They're needed to repair and build cells in the body, and they're also composed of amino acids. So we need amino acids in order to build these proteins that are essential to these processes in our cells and in our body. And there's three different types. There's essential, which are not produced by the body, non-essential, which are produced by the body, and conditional, which only become essential in times of illness or stress. Essential amino acids can't be made by the human body, which means that they must be acquired through diet. And we need these because they're required for a lot of important processes in the body and the cells. And there are 9 different kinds, and they're all listed in this chart on the right. There are many places in our diet that we can get proteins. One source is animal products, so that includes foods like red meat, fish, poultry, shellfish, processed meats, and eggs. And when it comes to foods like red meat and processed meats, we really want to stray away from those kind of foods, and we want to focus more on like fish and lean meat like poultry. Another great source of protein in the diet is soy products, and so that includes foods like tofu, tempeh, edamame, and soy nuts. And personally, this is my own favorite way to get protein in my diet. Another source of protein in the diet is low-fat dairy products like milk, cottage cheese, yogurt, and Greek yogurt. And there are many other plant-based sources of protein in our diet, like beans, nuts, nut butters, lentils, quinoa, and seeds, and they can all be excellent sources of protein. So protein can be divided up into what we call complete proteins and incomplete proteins. Complete proteins have all 9 of those essential amino acids that we talked about, which you need to get from your diet. So that includes foods like meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and dairy, as well as plant-based products like soy, quinoa, and chia seeds. And those are all just foods that have all 9 of those essential amino acids in a single food. And then incomplete proteins, they don't contain all 9 essential amino acids in one single food. And you can just combine different types of incomplete proteins in order to get all 9 essential amino acids. So if you don't eat any complete protein products in your day, you can just have a variety of incomplete proteins and you will still achieve all of your essential amino acids. And then the process of digestion and absorption of protein. So the proteins get denatured by your stomach acid once they're in your stomach. And basically what that means is your proteins are all folded up normally and the stomach acid basically unfolds the proteins, which is known as denaturing. And then those get broken into peptides by an enzyme called pepsin. And peptides are just shorter chains of amino acids together. And then the bonds between those amino acids, known as peptide bonds, are then broken down by enzymes that we have in our intestines. And those lead to smaller peptides and free amino acids, which are just amino acids that aren't linked together by anything. And those travel via your blood to your liver, where they are either used by your liver or they get put into your circulatory system, into your blood, to go be delivered to your other tissues for whatever processes they might need those amino acids for. And in our body, proteins play a lot of functions throughout all of our cells. So they're used for enzymes, hormones, membrane proteins, blood transport molecules, albumin, fingernails, hair, keratin, collagen. They're building blocks for muscle, bone, skin, blood, and cartilage. The amino acids are building blocks for coenzymes, hormones, nucleic acids, and these are all things we won't really get into the details of, but it is all essential to keep your body functioning and to grow a lot of really important parts of your body. And then they're also used for energy, and they're overall just needed to maintain our cellular function, to make sure our cells continue to work in our body. And finally, we're going to talk about the macromolecule fat. So we're going to talk about what fats are, types and sources of fats, digestion and absorption of fat, and effects and functions of fat within the body. So what are fats? They're essentially what are called triglycerides, which are composed of 1 glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids. Fatty acids are chains of carbons with hydrogens on them, and most can be made by the body, but there are 2 kinds that can't be made by the body, which are known as omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids and omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, and we'll get into the details of those. So there are 3 types of fats: unsaturated, saturated, and trans fats. So there are 2 different types of unsaturated fats, which are known as monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, and we'll get into those. And unsaturated fats overall decrease the risk of disease, and they come from sources such as vegetable oils, fish, nuts, and seeds. And then we don't really need to get into the chemistry of it. I just wanted to show that the different types of fatty acids are sorted based on how their structure looks. And so saturated fats have no double bonds between their carbons, meaning that they can be more saturated with carbons. And then monounsaturated fats, mono meaning 1, have 1 double bond between their carbons, and polyunsaturated, with poly meaning more than 1, have more than 1 double bond between their carbons. And in those unsaturated fats, every time there's a double bond, it creates a kink in the structure, which means that they can't be packed quite as tightly together. And so unsaturated fats are always liquid at room temperature because they can't be quite as packed together, while saturated fats are solid at room temperature. And like we said, monounsaturated fatty acids have 1 double bond, which you can see in this picture. They're actually synthesized by our body, so they're not essential for us to obtain from our own diet. And then polyunsaturated fatty acids, they have 2 or more double bonds, which you can see in this picture. There are two important ones to get from our diet that we don't make, which are called omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And those are known as essential fatty acids because we need them from our diet and because we don't produce them. And then saturated fats, like we talked about before, they have no double bonds, as you can see in this picture, compared to the unsaturated fat, which has a double bond. And they can actually negatively impact our health, and they're solid at room temperature. So some sources include red meat, cheese, ice cream, butter, coconut oil, and palm oil. And then trans fats really don't play any kind of role in our bodies, and they really just increase the risk of disease, and you should avoid them from your diet just as a whole. Some sources include processed foods, stick margarine, refrigerated dough, and fried foods. And fortunately, because of health concerns, trans fats have been largely eliminated from use in foods nowadays, but it's still important to check nutrition labels to make sure that there aren't trans fats in your foods. So next we're going to talk about fat digestion and absorption. So first, fat goes through your body and it ends up in your intestines where bile is released from your gallbladder. And as you can see in that picture there, bile has bile salts, which are those little green flecks. And what they do is they kind of surround the globs of fat and separate them, which is called emulsification. And then pancreatic lipase is released, which is an enzyme that's released from your pancreas that's used to help break down fats. And it performs what's called lipolysis, which you can see in that picture on the right, which takes the triglyceride, which has the glycerol and the 3 fatty acids, and it turns it into a monoglyceride, which is just 1 glycerol and 1 fatty acid, and then breaks the other 2 fatty acids to be free. And this breaks it up so that the body can then act on it further. And then these triglycerides are then repackaged into what are called chylomicrons, which is what you can see in this top right diagram. And it is packed with cholesterol, phospholipids, and apoproteins. And we really don't need to get into the details of it, but that's basically just a convenient little package that the body uses to transport triglycerides and cholesterol around. And if there are shorter fatty acid chains that are less than 12 carbons, those don't need to get repackaged and they just get transported directly to the liver through the blood. And then the chylomicrons, they go into the blood and they circulate around the body. They get taken up by fat cells for storage, they get taken up by muscle cells for energy, or they're returned to the liver. And so next we're going to talk about the functions and effects of unsaturated, saturated, and trans fats in the body. First, we're going to start off talking about the functions of omega-3 fatty acids. They're components of phospholipids in cell membranes, which means that they're necessary in order to kind of hold the cell together. And they provide energy. They play an important role in cardiovascular, pulmonary, immune, and endocrine health. And then they're also important for brain, retina, and sperm cell health. So there are 3 different types of omega-3 fatty acids. The first type, called eicosapentaenoic acid, which we just call it EPA, it produces eicosanoids, which play an important role in cardiovascular, pulmonary, immune, and endocrine systems, and those help reduce inflammation. Next, we have docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA, which is important for brain, retina, and sperm health and function. And finally, we have alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA, and really that just gets converted by your body to EPA and DHA so that it can be used for those processes. But it's converted kind of inefficiently, so it's best to get your sources from EPA and DHA. And omega-6 fatty acids, the other essential fatty acids, they also provide energy, they also contribute to eicosanoid production, they can help regulate inflammation when combined with omega-3s, but what's important is to get a good balance between omega-6 and omega-3s. And generally in the American diet, we get too many omega-6s and not enough omega-3s, and that can actually be pro-inflammatory and thereby have a negative effect on your body. And when it comes to the function of dietary saturated fats, it really doesn't provide anything to the body other than energy in the form of calories, but the body also produces its own saturated fats. So there's really no need to obtain it from the diet. And it has a lot of negative side effects. It can raise total cholesterol, raise LDL cholesterol, and increase your risk for cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. And then trans fats really don't have any function in the body, and they are just overall health negative. They mimic the properties of saturated fats, and they have all of the same negative side effects. They can raise total cholesterol, raise LDL cholesterol. They can actually lower HDL cholesterol, which is the good type of cholesterol that we want in our body. And then it also increases the risk for cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. And finally, we're just going to talk about a few takeaways, so kind of just an important summary of some of the main points made in this presentation. So carbs are comprised of sugars, starches, and fiber. Carbs in the body function to provide energy, store energy, build macromolecules, and spare protein and fat. Proteins are comprised of amino acids, which can be essential, non-essential, or conditional. Proteins come from a variety of animal and plant-based foods. Proteins play a role in every cell and many essential processes in the body. Fats are composed of 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acids. The body can make most fats, but they need omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids from the diet. Unsaturated fatty acids have health positive effects, while saturated and trans fats have health adverse effects. And then finally, what can you do with all the information you've learned from this presentation, and how can you apply it to your day-to-day life? And I'd say the biggest recommendations I have are 1, incorporate more fiber-rich carbohydrate sources into your diet. 2, avoid foods that are high in added sugars. 3, avoid foods high in saturated or trans fats. 4, choose plant-based proteins, seafood, or lean proteins over red meat. And 5, incorporate sources of omega-3 fatty acids into your diet. I just want to thank you all very much for watching my presentation, and I really hope you learned something that can help you live a healthier life.